Now that we've been to the fabric store and we've gotten our supplies, which included our pattern and our fabric, our elastic, and our thread. Now that we have that, it's time to start making our pajama pants. So we'll open our envelope and take out our pattern pieces and our instruction sheet. This is what the instruction sheet looks like. And find the pattern pieces that we need. And the way you do that is on page 1 of your pattern instruction sheet will be a drawing of all the things that you can make with your pattern. And it puts them in alphabetical order. And so right beside the drawings will be another drawing of the pattern pieces themselves. So it's pretty easy to tell the shape of pants. So we're making pants for a 5-year-old. And I can see from the list the numbers. They have 3 and 4 for the long pants, 5 and 6 for the short pants. Well, we're going to make the long pants. Now I said I'm making this for a 5-year-old, and the pattern is a multi-size pattern. So when you cut your pieces out, you don't want to cut necessarily on the exact size that you want to use, because if it's a smaller size than the largest one in the range, like this goes from 3 to 8, if you cut off at size 5, you'll no longer have, obviously, 6, 7, and 8. And especially for children, you would want to keep all of your sizes because they're going to grow, and you may in the future want to make another pair. So you have 2 choices. One choice is to take the pattern itself and on the size that you want to fold it over to that size and just kind of press it down like that. The other choice would be to get some pattern tracing paper and trace off the size that you want to use. So you just have this one size, which is much easier. And then at a later time, if you want to make another pair in either size 6, 7, or 8, you can do the same thing. So the choice is yours. And it also depends on what it is that you're making. And with the pajama pants, it's so simple. I definitely recommend tracing it off. So in tracing it off, you want to start with what we refer to as the grain line. On the pattern itself, it doesn't have the word grain line, but you can identify it because it has an arrowed line. And years ago, the pattern companies would put the word grain line on there. Well, you might wonder, what is grain line? Well, we're going to look at this fabric, and I'm going to show you where it is. The grain line is the vertical up and down direction of your fabric. And also on this edge here, this is referred to as selvage. You're going to see that word selvage on your cutting layout, which I'm going to show you in just a minute. So if you should, kind of pull on that fabric in the grain line direction, you're going to see that it doesn't really move. It doesn't have stretch in it, or very, very little stretch. So this is your grain line direction. When you go across from selvage edge to selvage edge, this is referred to as cross grain. If you think about it, your grain lines are going this way and you're going across those grain lines. So this is called cross grain. And if you pull on that, a bit of stretch there, all right? So it's important that when you cut out your pattern pieces, that you always measure and have them what we call straight to the grain. So that's why you have this line, this grain line on each pattern piece. Every pattern piece will either have a grain line on it, or it will say place on fold, which that fold is also your grain line direction. So when I trace off a pattern, this is my beginning point, because in tracing, if I should happen to move my paper just a little bit, then that could cause the grain line to be off. So in tracing these two pieces, I started by lining up my grain line first and then going around the outer edges. And if you notice on here, we have, it's called, we call them notches. Some people think of them as triangles, but those are notches. And the notches help you when you're making your garment. It helps you to know where to put the front and the back together. And there's something that you don't want to ignore. And I have drawn the notches from the original pattern to go out as well as how they're drawn in. And that's because we were going to use a serger once we finish cutting out our pattern pieces. And we want to keep those notches. And if we cut in, sometimes people cut too close or even beyond what our seam allowance is. So this way, by going out, we're going to be sure we can see those notches and we're not going to cut them off. And I do make them larger than what the pattern has. If you notice here, this is a single notch, one notch, and this is a double. And the way I have it, I don't cut two individual ones, I just cut one. And in looking at your two pattern pieces, your front and your back, you're going to see that there will be a difference in the number of notches that the pattern has. You're going to see that with this particular pattern, the front has 2 notches at the center curve, and the back has 3. Now, not all patterns will be this way. Some patterns will have a single notch on the front, and if they do, the back will have a double notch. And then other patterns won't even put a notch on the front, but they'll have a single notch on the back. So the back will always have one more notch. Now, another way you can tell the difference between the front and the back is in this center curve. If you look at it, you're going to see that the back curve is longer than the front curve because you need that for your buns. And so it's very obvious there is a difference between the back and the front. The third way you can tell the difference between your front and your back pieces is in the width of the leg. So if I put these on top of each other and I line it on the side edge like that, you're going to see that the back extends out beyond the front. So those are the 3 ways you know whether you're using a front or a back. Today I'm using a simplicity pattern for children, and you'll notice that the steps are really the same as if you were using an adult pattern as they are for a child's pattern. So there's just really no significant difference. The steps will be the same. Now let's talk adjustments. And this is an adult pattern, and we're going to be using a child's pattern, but as an adult, you will find markings on it that are different than on a child's pattern. And we always want to make sure we have 2 things, that it's large enough in the hip and we have the right inseam. When you need to make an adjustment in the inseam, you're first going to place a tape measure at the crotch line, and that should be indicated on the pattern, and measure down to see what the length of the pattern inseam is. And in this case, it happens to be 30.5. Now you measure your own inseam, and I always suggest taking a pair of pants that you really like the length of them and measure the inseam on those pants. When I say measure your pants, you're going to go from this point down to the bottom edge, and that's going to tell you the inseam measurement. So let's compare. This is, all right, this goes to 27.5. All right, so we'll just pretend that we need a 27.5 inch inseam, and this one happens to be 30.5. So what can we do? Well, we don't just chop off the bottom of the pattern. Instead, you look for the 2 narrow lines that will be drawn on the pattern piece. So if we want to shorten it, we take the pattern and we fold right on those 2 lines. We want to have it right on the 2 lines. And whatever we need to shorten, we want to fold it up half of that number. So if we needed to shorten it, let's say 2 inches, we'd fold it here, then take the bottom, I'm holding the fold, and we would bring it up, and we would fold up 1 inch. Whatever amount you want to shorten it, you fold it half that number. So you can take a tape measure, and when you're pinning this to the new length, be sure you start with your grain line, because you want that grain line to be straight. You don't want the grain line to be off to one side. So you want to fold and pin at the grain line first. Now we just put a pin in there to temporarily hold it in place. And then continue to measure and pin the 1 inch or 2 inch difference that you'll need before you cut it out. Now obviously if you needed a longer length, you would, instead of folding that, you would cut right in between those 2 lines and get some paper, put it underneath, tape it on to whatever size you would need. So you adjust your inseam. You don't just cut off or add paper on the end of the pattern piece. You do it at the marking that's indicated on the pattern. Once we have our pattern pieces cut out, then we would need to look at the cutting layout on the pattern to see how we place the pieces onto the fabric. And they're going to give you some choices. It's going to be based on 2 things: how wide your fabric is and the size that you are using. Now you'll notice that some of the layouts will say all sizes, and others will give specific sizes. Like in this example, they have sizes 3 and 4 only. And then the next one is size 5, 6, 7, and 8. So pay attention to the size that you want to use, and also know the width of your fabric. And that's easy to know because you can just take a tape measure, and we have it folded like it came off the bolt that we bought in the store. And we're going to measure, and this measures 22 inches. So multiply that by 2. So this fabric is 44 inches wide. So you want to follow the 44, 45 inch drawing, but you'll also notice there's 58, 60 inch drawing. So that obviously is for wider fabric, and it doesn't take as much fabric. In looking at the pattern drawings, you're going to see with some patterns they use the word selvage. Sometimes they abbreviate it and use SEL, like in this case. And then they have the word fold to show you what you do with your fabric before you put the pattern onto the fabric. So you want to replicate what you see in the drawing. So today we're going to follow for pants the 44, 45 inch width fabric for all sizes. Now, notice it also mentions nap, and people wonder, what is nap? I've had a lot of students ask me, what is nap? Well, I always say, think about velvet, or think about corduroy. When you take your hand and you rub it over the fabric, one direction it'll be smooth and the other direction it'll be rough. So there's a distinct difference. And that can apply to fabric that has a direction. Like what I'm using today does not have a direction. We call this non-directional print. But here's an example of fabric that does have a direction. So if you are using a directional print, you want to make sure that you don't turn one of the pattern pieces upside down. So you always want them going in the same direction. I have the fabric folded as it was when I brought it home from the store, and I've already pressed it. It's always a good idea to press your fabric to see if you have any wrinkles in it. And we're ready now to put the pieces onto the fabric. And remember how I talked about the grain line? Well, when I drew off the pattern, the grain line was where I started. Now that I'm going to place the pattern onto the fabric, the grain line is where I'm going to start. Because I want to make sure that grain line, that I have it straight to the grain. I mentioned before that we're doing a child's pattern. If you're doing an adult pattern, first thing I want you to do is make sure you have enough fabric. And the way you do that is you just fold the fabric in half vertically and take one pattern piece and lay it down and make sure that you've got fabric all around your pattern and you don't have anything hanging off, all right? It's very disappointing when you start to cut out a pattern and you get down to the very last piece and you don't have enough fabric. So always check before you begin that you do have enough fabric. It's not an issue with this project, but it is a consideration when you're doing an adult pattern. So we're going to take our two pattern pieces, and since they're rather small, we can have them easily going in the same direction. But I'm just going to measure and pin one at a time. I want to start on this side with measuring. And when I measure, I have a choice as to whether I measure from the grain line over to the selvage edge or from the grain line to the folded edge. I always select the folded edge because that's a more defined edge than the selvage edge. So when you measure, you place the tape measure at either end, it doesn't matter which one, and I put it right on the line and I measure down to the fold. And in this case, I'm going to move this just a little bit. I now have 17 inches from the grain line to the folded edge. Before I do anything else, I want to secure this. So I want to place a pin on this line, and you just take the point of the pin and you take it through the two layers of fabric and lift up with the point of the pin. Now that is secure. Now I need to measure the other end of the grain line. I have the ability by having it secure that I can move my pattern in order to make sure this end of the grain line is the same as the other. So when I measure this second point, I always like to put it at the number I had initially. So it's 17 inches. So I put it at 17 first, lay it across the pattern, and I can see now that I do need to move my pattern just a little bit to get it up to where it needs to be. Once it's there, I'm going to take another pin and pin that down the same way as I did the other end. Once those ends are pinned, I no longer need the tape measure to finish pinning the pattern onto the fabric. And you always want to put your pins inside the area you're cutting. Well, this being only one size, that's pretty easy. You don't want your pins to cross your cutting line. You want to make sure that you're not going to have a problem when it comes to cutting your pattern pieces. I like to cut my corners first, and I don't put a lot of pins in. And I am a pinner. I don't use weights unless the fabric is such that I need to. So I'm going to pin my 4 corners, or 5, and maybe put one right here along this edge. All right, now we're going to repeat this for the other pattern piece. We know we have enough room for it. And this time, I'm going to measure again from the grain line down to the edge. And I think I want to see if I can get that at a whole number. It doesn't have to be a whole number. It can be anything, really. I just like to have whole numbers. That's all. Let's see. Well, there it is. We have it at 5. So once I see the number, I'm going to take a pin again and pin it in place. And now I'm going to put the tape measure at 5 and then measure up, and it's also 5 inches. When I'm teaching someone in So Much Fun, I usually pin and partially cut one pattern piece, and then I tell them to do it without my assistance, because I want people to learn here enough that they're going to be able to do this at home on their own. And I also highly recommend that whenever you're learning how to make pajama pants, it's so much fun that you also, if possible, make another pair at home. And that'll be the best way for you to remember what you have learned when you've been in class. Now we have our pieces pinned and we're ready to cut. And you want to use good fabric scissors. Please do not use paper scissors. I have my pieces here to cut, and I'm going to start by just cutting across the width of the fabric. And when you cut, you want to keep the lower blade of your scissors on the table. You don't want to hold your fabric up off the table. You should keep it on the table. And you always want to have your arm in a comfortable position. You don't want to twist your arm. You want to be able to cut a nice straight edge. And when I cut, I keep my left hand sort of to the front and to the side. And I just cut, and then I slide up to where I stop. You don't want to chop your fabric. That's not a good choice. We just want to cut it. I'll just cut out this way for now and get this off of here, because we are working with small pieces, but sometimes you have quite a bit. And so in order to be able to cut them out comfortably without twisting your arm, you're going to either need to move your fabric or you should walk around the table. But always have your arm in a comfortable position. So I would not ever take it and be cutting around like this or bringing it around toward me. You always are going away from yourself, and you cut and slide, and that way you'll get a nice straight edge. That's the goal, because you're going to follow this when you go to your sewing machine. And if you've chopped up your fabric, it's going to make it very difficult to be able to sew a nice consistent straight seam. Now I've cut up this side to the point where I've come to a notch, and I'm going to stop, and you notice I've turned my fabric around. I happen to be very right-handed, so I don't want to continue in that direction. I'm going to come to the other end, and I'm going to cut up to the notch and stop. And then I want to cut away from the pattern. I do not want to cut into the pattern. All right, because some people are just too big of cutters and they cut too far. So now I have my single notch there. All right, now we're going to go over here to the other side. You don't have to continue in the same direction. You can just cut whatever is comfortable. That's what you cut. All right, here we have a double notch. So I go up, across, and then I go down, and I get my double notch. It's obvious you'll be able to tell the difference between a single notch and a double notch. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I let my students do the cutting after they have seen me cut part of a pattern piece, and I walk away from them. I don't stay there with them. I think people kind of feel maybe a little bit uncomfortable, and I think it's best for them to have the experience. And if they have a question, you know, of course I'm going to answer it and help them in that way. But, you know, from the very beginning, I want you to, you know, feel good about what you're doing. Now I still have this bottom edge to cut. I'm trying to hold on to it since it's such a small piece. And then we're going to cut at this end. Once we finish cutting out our pattern pieces, we're going to take the pattern off. And when you remove that pattern, you still have to know which piece it is. And we've already talked about the 3 ways you know. But sometimes you will have fabric that is a solid, or it's a woven pattern, and you really can't tell the difference between the right side or the wrong side. So in those cases, it's really important that you mark what is the wrong side of your fabric. Now, this is obvious. This is the wrong side of the fabric. But if you only do this step occasionally, the one time you should have done it, you will not have done it. So Do it for every time you cut out a pattern. So we're going to take a piece of painter's tape. I suggest painter's tape and not masking tape. There's not as much residue on painter's tape. It's very easy to remove. So I place the painter's tape on the wrong side of the fabric, not the right side, but the wrong side. And I'm going to write on that tape what the pattern number is. And in this case, it's number 3. So I'm going to put that on there. And then on the other piece, I'm going to write the word front. You always want to do things that are going to help you as you're making your garment. And this way, when we start reading our pattern directions and they make reference to the front and to the back, if you don't remember, then just look inside on the wrong side and you'll see what the pattern piece is. Now that we've finished cutting out our pattern, the next step is going to be serging. So let's move to the serger. Now we have our pattern cut out and we're going to serge the edges before we go to the sewing machine. So I want to give you a little bit of an explanation about the serger. Most beginners have never used a serger before, so I like to talk about it to help them get familiar with it. A serger is made entirely different than a sewing machine. If you open it up, you're going to see that there is no bobbin. A sewing machine has a bobbin, but a serger does not. A serger has a different purpose than a sewing machine. We're using the serger mainly to put stitches on the edge of the fabric. So when the garment is washed, the fabric will not fray. I'm going to point out some things about it that also are different from a sewing machine. The biggest thing is the blade. Right here where I have my fingertip, that is a blade. So you have to be very careful when you're serging your fabric that you don't cut off the edges. Right behind it, you'll notice that there are 2 needles. Sewing machines usually use 1 needle. Sergers, for the most part, use 2. And if you look above, you're going to see that there are 4 spools of thread. And the serger thread is a lighter weight thread than what you use at a sewing machine. Serger thread is 2-ply and sewing machine thread is 3-ply. Being a retired school teacher, I value practice. I think everybody needs to practice before they actually do what they need to do on their project. That helps you feel more comfortable with it, and if you're going to make any big mistakes, you'll do it on your practice fabric rather than on your pants. So prior to actually serging your pant pieces, we're going to practice. When you get ready to serge, you want to just serge 1 piece of fabric at a time, 1 edge at a time. Because we have the blade, if you should try to serge 1 edge and then just continue on to the next edge, you'll just cut that corner right off. So you want to make sure that you're only serging 1 edge at a time. So I first want people to practice just the straight edge. And when you begin, again, only 1 piece of fabric, you're not making the pants here, you're only putting stitches on the edge. You want to take that front edge and you want it to slide under the foot back to where the 2 needles are. So reach around with your left hand only. I've caught some people trying to take it with their right hand and then you get into these threads and that's a problem. So always use your left hand, reach around, and that's what you can do to raise and lower your foot. Always raise and lower the foot. Do not drop the foot, because in dropping the foot, in time, you're going to wear the bottom of your foot and you'll have to replace it. So we're going to slide that front edge up to where the 2 needles are, right here. There are the needles, here's the front edge of the fabric. Along here where that blade is, there's a groove right in front of the blade. So the edge that's going to get stitches on it should be in line with the groove. Then you can reach around, find the lever, and gently lower the foot. And now you're going to be ready to serge. And when you do, put your right hand under the fabric, put your left hand on top. You're just gently holding it, touching it. You're not really putting any tension on it. And then you're ready to step on the foot pedal. And when you do, you don't know how much pressure, so just gently go down on the foot pedal until you get a speed that you're comfortable with. All right, once students have practiced serging a straight edge and then with a notch and feel comfortable with using the machine, then they'll be ready to serge their pant pieces. I always give everyone this to show them what they are to serge and what they're not to serge. So they're to serge the top, the bottom, and the two sides, but not the curve. Now that we have cut out our pants and have serged our fabric, we're ready to go to the sewing machine and learn how to thread it and use it. And we're going to make our pants, and we're going to have so much fun.